Chapter 23. Memnock opened the door to the eye and waved Millil over.
Come, Memnock wishes to see the elf girl.
Millil crossed the laboratory and climbed into the eye with Memnock. The Guardian touched the appropriate controls and all the screens lit up. Each of them showed a different scene, each giving a different view of Mirrodin. The plains, swamp, mountains, oceans, and forest of the metal planets were all represented. Memnock turned another knob, and 5 of the 6 screens changed to a picture of the interior. They were all the same, but each from a different angle. In the center of all 5 screens, a lone thresher rolled along open ground. On the 6th screen was a view of inside of the eye, the view of Mellor's point of view. The metal man looked into the screen, and it reproduced what he saw a billion times, like 2 mirrors facing each other. Mellor looked at what Memnock saw when Memnock looked through his eyes, and that image layered itself upon itself into infinity, making an endless hallway surrounded by the interior of the eye. An unexpected discovery, thought the Guardian. Something he'd have to explore later, when the elf girl was finally within his grasp. Mellor turned his attention to one of the other 5 screens, and the view through his eyes too showed the lone device on the interior of Mirrodin.
Why are we looking at thresher, Master?
Because, Mellil, the elf girl is inside.
Memnock squinted, spotting something heading towards his prize. One of the screens shifted its view, narrowing in on another lone creature, speeding towards the thresher atop a hoverer.
What is he doing here?
The inside of the thresher's body was very dark. It reminded Glissa of the time Bosch had placed her in his chest cavity. Only this time the world wasn't spinning. Considering the circumstances, it was a comfortable ride. The chamber was spacious, enough for her to sit cross-legged and not have to duck her head, and the sides of the creature were soft. After having hit the thresher with her fists, and even kicking until she became winded, Glissa concluded that it didn't feel any pain, at least not from the inside. So she sat waiting. What a predicament! Swallowed whole by a thresher after having lost her sword. It was a wonder she'd made it this far at all. She laughed at the thought. Slobad had been so worried about what she would use for a weapon once they'd put the Caldra champion together. Evidently, it didn't matter. She thought about what awaited her at the end of this ride. Was Brenna being taken to the same place? Would she finally meet Memnock? This wasn't exactly the way she had envisioned it. Glissa felt the thresher slow down. Her heart raced, and she prepared to draw mana. The creature came to an abrupt stop. It jerked backwards, and then a sharp tip of a short blade cut through the creature's exterior, nearly punching straight into Glissa's forehead. The blade slid sideways and the thresher shook. Blood poured into the hollow cavity, and light seeped in through the wound. Glissa could only make out a hand and forearm attached to the blade. Blue skin. Another blade struck the beast and punched through. Glissa pushed herself back in the chamber, staying as far from the weapons as possible. Then she drew as much mana as she could. The arcane energies flowed to her, and she cast a spell, growing nearly twice her size in a blink of an eye. Her body quickly filled the confined space, and her arms were pinned to her sides by the thresher's flesh. She had known this would happen, and avoided just this situation earlier in the ride. Kicking with all her might, her engorged legs connected with the front of the thresher, right beneath where the blade had cut into its hide. Flesh tore and light flooded in. Glissa was free. Getting to her feet, the giant elf pulled the remaining bits of the thresher's corpse from her head and looked down on the Vidalcan.
Pontifex?
The four-armed lord glared back at her.
You have taken me from my god. You have taken me from my kingdom.
He lifted a bloody sword in each hand.
Now I am going to take your life.
The Vidalcan lunged at the elf, cutting 2 long gashes in her thigh before she could react. The wounds would have been much worse if Glissa had not been so big, but they were still painful, and the elf gave ground. Lifting off into the air on his hoverer, the Vidalcan brandished a pair of matched short swords. Pontifex shot forward, swooping around the giant elf, charging right at her head. Glissa ducked, shuffling forward and putting her hand to the ground to keep from falling. The hoverer just missed her, tousling her hair as it shot past. Catching her balance, Glissa stood up and turned, keeping the Vidalcan where she could see him. Pontifex stopped dead, and with a thought, twisted the hoverer in mid-air. Its nose pointed at Glissa. He rode at her again. This time Glissa sidestepped to her right, swatting the Vidalcan as if he were a buzzing fly. Pontifex anticipated her move and swung the hoverer to the left, bringing the sharp edge of the blade across her shoulder. The elf hissed at the wound and jerked away from the attack, bringing her other hand up in defense. Pontifex's mind urged his vehicle away, but he was too close. The elf's hand swung by him, swirling the air around his hoverer. Pontifex bounced through the wind stream, then the hoverer flipped over and spun, tossing the rider from his mount. The Vidalcan dropped to the ground. Glissa lifted a foot in the air, prepared to step on her foe. "I'm going to squash you like a bug." She lowered her foot, casting a great shadow. Pontifex got to his knees. One of his left arms had been wounded in the fall, and he held it tight against his body.
"I have nothing left to live for,"
he said. He shouted a one-syllable spell, extending his two good arms out for the big elf. A whirlwind of swirling blue energies enwrapped Glissa, whipping her hair about her head and draining from her the magics that had enlarged her to giant size. The elf shrank. The world around her grew larger, and the powers that made her bigger and stronger were sucked away. When she reached normal size, the whipping wind released her. The swirling storm glided over the ground, pushing the mossy covering this way and that, headed straight for the wounded Vidalcan. Once again, the storm enclosed its victim. Pontifex disappeared from view, surrounded entirely in swirling energy. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the wind died, and the storm stopped, dropping away to reveal the Vidalcan beneath. Pontifex was fully healed, and he began to grow. His arms stretched and his legs lifted him high into the air. His head, already big for a Vidalcan, became larger than a troll's. The blue-skinned Vidalcan grew to titanic proportions, towering over the elf. Glissa put her foot down. "Can we talk about this?" Pontifex took a giant step forward, and Glissa had to jump to one side to avoid being squashed. The elf darted away, spotting a cluster of 4 or 5 small mycosynth monoliths. She made for the cover they provided. When she reached the growth, she fell behind them, putting her back up against a monolith, trying to catch her breath. At least they were sharp, so Pontifex would have to think twice before trying to step on her.
"You cannot hide forever,"
shouted the giant Vidalcan. "Don't count on it," said Glissa under her breath. Pontifex began pacing around the cluster.
"Come out and face me."
Glissa slid behind a different monolith, staying hidden and quiet. The Vidalcan got down on his hands and knees and peered into the middle of the mycosynth. Pontifex's huge eye glared down on Glissa. Though she tried to scoot down, hiding between 2 of the metal formations, she couldn't escape his gaze. Reaching in with his enlarged finger, Pontifex poked around inside the cluster. He sneered, keeping his eye on her as he dug around for his prize. But the formation was too tightly packed, and he was too big. The sharp edges of the mycosynth cut his skin, and frustrated his attempts to get Glissa. Finally, Pontifex stood up.
"Fine, we shall do this the hard way."
Waving his arms in the air, a wisp of blue mana flared from each of his 4 hands. The Vidalcan disappeared from sight. Glissa stood up. She peered around the edge of the monolith. No Pontifex. Craning her neck, she looked the other way. No Pontifex? Grabbing a handful of the mossy ground cover, she tapped into the flying mana here in the interior and forced some of it into her hands. The sticky substance bent to her will, elongating and weaving itself into a long, thin fibre. Folding over one end to make a thicker handle, Glissa gave her makeshift whip a quick flick. The end shot out and snapped with a loud pop. She nodded. It would do. She took a deep breath and burst into the open, guessing at where Pontifex must be. Coming out from behind the cluster of monoliths, the elf lifted her whip for a quick surprise strike. Only there was no Pontifex. Spinning around, she scanned the area. Still no Pontifex.
"Looking for me?"
came a voice. Glissa's head darted. She looked up, down, side to side, but she couldn't see anything. Dropping into a crouch, the elf spun a slow circle, trying to be prepared for anything. Behind her, she heard the mossy ground shuffle, and she turned. Too late. Something hard hit the back of her head, and the world spun. Glissa dropped her whip and fell. Pontifex stood over the incapacitated elf. She rolled around on the ground, holding the back of her head. Finally, turning over on her back and looking up at him.
"That wasn't nearly as hard as I thought it would be."
Glissa's eyes were nearly crossed from the pain. He'd hit her hard. It was a wonder the blow hadn't killed her outright. But he was glad it hadn't. He wanted this to last a while. He wanted to torture her as much as she had tortured him. Dropping to his knees, he straddled the elf's chest, pulling her arms down and pinning them under his legs. He then grabbed her chin in one of her hands and examined her face, holding his matched short swords near her throat with two others.
"What is it that Memnock sees in you?"
Pontifex roughly shoved her head from side to side.
"What is it that you have that I do not?"
Glissa remained silent, her eyes mostly closed, her lips curled in a grimace of pain. Pontifex shook his head.
"How is it that such an insignificant creature could take my place at its side? Look at you. Your body is yet to evolve past only having two arms. What use is a creature such as this?"
Glissa's eyes were beginning to clear. Though she was hardly lucid, it was evident that the pain in the back of her head was beginning to subside.
"It's no matter, really. Once I've killed you, Memnock will have no choice but to take me back. You'll see that I was the only choice, and understand the folly of his thinking."
The Vidalcan nodded, decidedly convinced by his own words.
"The only question is how swiftly your death will come."
The glowing blue blade of the Vidalcan halberd slipped under his chin.
"It will not come at all,"
said a voice. A cold chill ran down his spine, and Pontifex lifted his chin as far as it would go, touching the top of his head to his back. Another Vidalcan came into view.
"Marek," he said, "you startled me."
He reached up and put his fingers on the halberd blade, pushing it away. Marek pressed back, and the blade sliced into Pontifex's fingers.
"What is this?"
"I won't let you kill her, Pontifex," said Marek,
his eyes narrow. Pontifex tried to lean forward. Marek held his halberd tight against Pontifex's throat, unmoving.
"After all I did for you, to do this to me now?"
said Pontifex.
"Yes, I owe you my life," said Marek.
"Then why are you doing this?"
"Because I have a duty to the Vidalcan Republic."
"Vidalcan Republic? Don't tell me you buy all of that nonsense Orland is spouting about representation for the people."
Marek nodded.
"Yes, Pontifex, that's exactly what I'm telling you."
"Please, Marek, we were friends, partners."
Pontifex swallowed.
"You helped me hunt this very elf. You, as much as anyone, wanted to see her head on top of that pike, and now you can have it. All that work, all that time we spent chasing this prize, and now she is within reach."
He looked back into Marek's eyes, the back of his head still touching his shoulder blades.
Please release this blade and let us talk about this as friends."
Marek's eyes focused in the distance, his mind somewhere else. Pontifex watched, hoping that his words had gotten through. His neck hurt from craning back so far, and the skin on his throat was so tight against his Adam apple, making it hard to breathe. If he got out of this, he would kill the elf, and then he would kill Marek for his betrayal. Marek's glassy gaze came back to Pontifex. As he shook his head,
I owe you so much. If I let you go through with this, let you betray Memnarch in the name of the Vidalcan Empire, you will doom us all. Your actions will cast a shadow on all that you have accomplished. Your greed and petty jealousies could be the downfall of the greatest revolution in Vidalcan history.
Marek's eyes grew soft, sad.
I'm not about to let you do that.
Pontifex rolled backwards, away from Marek's halberd, bringing his twin swords up and thrusting at his attacker as he tumbled. Each blade bit deep, puncturing skin, bone, and lung. Completing his somersault, the one-time Vidalcan lord came up to his feet, the front of his robes drenched in blue blood. Marek stood for a moment longer, then dropped to his knees. The lengths of Pontifex's matched blades were buried to the hilt in his chest. Pontifex tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't work, and a sharp pain ran down his spine as he tried. Touching his throat, he felt a long gash where Marek's halberd had been. Looking down at himself, he realized that the blood on his robes was not Marek's, but his own. His head felt light, and the mana core seemed to grow brighter, nearly washing out all colour, turning everything to a hazy white. Marek toppled forward. Pontifex could see the ends of his blades protruding from his back. The head of the Vidalcan elite guard shuddered once, then fell still. Pontifex slumped down beside his one-time friend, his vision narrowing, his thoughts drifting away before he could finish them. A warm, soft buzz filled his whole body. It seemed to brush away the pain in his throat and the anguish in his heart.
What have I done?
Slowly, the last leader of the Vidalcan Synod lowered his head to rest on his friend's shoulders and closed his eyes.